The air in the jungle felt thick enough to drink. The last echoes of gunfire had just died when a white cloth fluttered above a shattered bamboo hut. The Japanese nurses and clerks, uniforms torn and faces streaked with sweat, stepped out slowly, the sound of boots crunching gravel marking the arrival of American soldiers. A strange silence fell over the clearing, heavier than fear itself. One officer barked an order, "Separate the women." No one dared move until he shouted again. The women, about 300 by later estimates, were lined up beneath the sun. Their rank insignias were stripped, their medical armbands taken. To them, surrender was unthinkable, drilled into their bones since childhood. Yet here they stood, unarmed, with nothing left but the dust on their hands. One Japanese nurse later wrote, "We felt like paper, folded, used, then thrown away." The Americans moved efficiently, cataloging each prisoner. A camera clicked. The women avoided the lens. They were not beaten, not yelled at, just looked through as if already erased. The war in Southeast Asia was ending, but in that moment, time seemed to freeze between two moral worlds colliding. When the first American sergeant stepped forward carrying a canvas duffel, everyone expected food or blankets. Instead, he dumped out a pile of torn khaki underwear, men's underwear, stained and stretched from field use. For a second, no one spoke. Then the translator said flatly, "You will wear these." The words didn't register at first. Then shame did what bullets couldn't. It broke them. One young Japanese clerk pressed the rough fabric to her chest and whispered, "We have lost more than the war, we have lost face." Around her, others wept silently, some too shocked even to move. The Americans, uncomfortable, shifted their weight, unsure what they had just done. To them it was logistics, to the women, humiliation. Evening fell over the camp. The jungle hissed with insects, and the smell of sweat mixed with salt tears. Somewhere, an officer lit a cigarette and said, "Orders are orders." Inside the barracks, the women sat cross-legged on wooden planks, staring at the pile of garments in disbelief. Then, slowly, one reached for a needle. The night would be filled with the faint sound of sewing. Morning arrived without ceremony, just the rasp of boots and the clang of metal mess tins. In the humid light, the Japanese women stood in two silent rows, as a corporal carried in more sacks. Everyone expected rice or soap, maybe clean bedding. Instead, the same torn khaki briefs spilled across the ground. Some were ripped at the seams, others stiff from sweat and dirt. The corporal muttered, "Orders from supply, no female issue available." Then he walked off. No one translated that. They didn't have to. The humiliation translated itself. A young nurse named Fumiko picked up a pear, holding it between two fingers like it might burn her. The coarse fabric smelled of engine grease and rain. She looked around, every woman frozen in disbelief. A few whispered prayers. Others turned away, covering their faces. To be handed another man's underclothes was not just unclean. In Japanese culture, it was the collapse of dignity itself. The Americans didn't mean cruelty. They simply had nothing else. Females, Pacific clothing made up exactly 0% of the U.S. Army's supply manifests at that time, every item designed for male soldiers or male prisoners. The quartermaster's logic was cold. Fabric is fabric. But in those khaki scraps, the women felt stripped of everything human. One woman later wrote in her diary, "They thought we were grateful. We were humiliated." She and others tried to refuse, but refusal wasn't an option. Regulations said, "POW, you must remain clothed." The guard's eyes followed them, awkward, almost guilty. Someone joked nervously, "At least it's clean." And the silence that followed was worse than any insult. When the order came to put them on, the women obeyed trembling hands, bowed heads. Some tore the garments apart to make them less recognizable, trying to sew them into makeshift skirts. The rough seams scraped their skin, but it was better than nakedness. They worked quietly, sharing needles, muttering prayers for dignity. That night, inside the dim barracks, the scratching of thread against cloth echoed softly, like insects in the dark. Each woman tried to turn shame into survival, piece by piece. Outside, a guard leaned on his rifle and listened, unsure what he was hearing, defiance or grief disguised as work. By dawn, the first shapes of crude garments began to take form. The barracks smelled of damp wood and oil smoke. Candles flickered in bottles, casting uneven shadows across faces bent in concentration. The Japanese women, still in their patched khaki, sat on the floor cross-legged, sewing in silence. Every few minutes a thread snapped, a needle pricked skin, and someone hissed softly through their teeth. The room felt more like a shrine than a cell. They were working with whatever scraps they had: torn sleeves, burlap rice sacks, even bandages salvaged from the infirmary. The goal wasn't fashion, it was invisibility, to make something that let them feel human again. The fabric smelled of gun oil, but their stitches were neat, deliberate. One nurse said later, each line of thread was a heartbeat, each skirt a prayer. Outside, rain hammered the tin roof, drowning out the faint murmur of English voices. Inside, the rhythm of sewing filled the air: scritch, pull, knot. When the lights dimmed, they worked by touch, guided by memory and pride. Supplies were almost non-existent. Official records showed each camp was allocated barely 4 yards of cloth per month for all repairs combined. They stretched that beyond reason, piecing together what looked like uniforms for ghosts. One woman paused to examine her handiwork, a crude skirt stitched from 2 undershirts. She laughed quietly, the first sound of levity in weeks. "Every stitch is defiance," she whispered, and the others smiled without looking up. It wasn't rebellion against the Americans. It was rebellion against despair. When morning came, the women stepped outside in their improvised garments. The hems were uneven, the colors mismatched, but something had changed. They stood taller, even under the weight of heat and hunger. A few guards stopped mid-stride, watching them with unreadable expressions: surprise, maybe respect. Then came the whistle for inspection. The women lined up, their home, made clothing trembling in the breeze. An American sergeant walked down the row, face unreadable. His eyes paused on the stitches, on the trembling hands holding torn seams together. He said nothing. Behind him, a younger private snickered, earning a sharp rebuke. The women looked straight ahead. The dignity they'd sown through the night would be tested under the daylight gaze of their captors. And the morning inspection would change everything. The sun burned white through the haze as the women stood in formation, rows of mended fabric and lowered eyes. Their makeshift skirts fluttered faintly in the humid air, seams trembling under the weight of shame. The American guards moved slowly between them, clipboards in hand, faces unreadable. The silence was so deep you could hear the flap of a flag somewhere down the camp road. One private, barely out of his teens, muttered something crude under his breath. The sound cracked the stillness like a whip. A captain turned sharply, his jaw tightening. "Stand down," he barked, his voice slicing through the air. The private stiffened, embarrassed. Even the women noticed the difference in tone, a discipline that didn't fit cruelty, but something colder, control. A medic standing nearby glanced at the prisoners, then at the men beside him. Regulations say humane treatment. He said quietly. The captain didn't answer, just scribbled notes and walked on. On paper, the U.S. Army manual was clear: prisoners of war must be treated with humanity, regardless of rank or gender. But in reality, every camp was its own world, and oversight depended on whoever wore the bars that week. The gaze of the guards became its own form of punishment, not violent, not verbal, just watching. The women felt the weight of it as they stood motionless, their hands trembling at their sides. It wasn't hatred they saw in the Americans' eyes. It was confusion. They couldn't understand the shame they'd inflicted. For the women, being seen like this, dressed in men's torn underwear, skirts stitched from surrender, was worse than hunger. One nurse wrote later, their pity was worse than anger. And that pity hung in the air like humidity, heavy and inescapable. When the inspection ended, the captain called one sergeant aside. A few minutes later, a message was typed and sealed. A formal complaint about the women's condition and clothing addressed to regional headquarters. It was never logged officially, but word spread among the ranks. Someone wanted it changed. That night, the barracks buzzed with quiet speculation. Maybe headquarters would send supplies. Maybe someone would notice. The women dared not hope, but somewhere beyond the barbed wire, a typewriter clacked out their first unseen ally. And miles away, another kind of voice began to move, one that wrote letters. The rain came without warning, a sudden downpour that blurred the outlines of the camp into streaks of gray. Inside the barracks, the Japanese women sat hunched over scraps of paper, pencils dull from overuse. For the first time, the guards had allowed them to write letters home. Hope flickered, small but dangerous. They wrote quietly, afraid the words might vanish if spoken aloud. Each letter was an act of balance, tell enough to show survival, not enough to reveal humiliation. We are being treated adequately. One wrote, carefully avoiding the truth about the clothing. Another began, I remain healthy, though she was weak from fever. Their language twisted under censorship, every line a mask. They were not writing for comfort. They were writing to prove existence. A nurse named Aiko tucked her folded letter inside a Bible she had carried since Singapore. She hoped a sympathetic guard would send it with the next Red Cross convoy. The letter described not the torn underwear, but the feeling it is difficult to hold your head high when the fabric is not yours. Her handwriting wavered near the end, where she wrote, Still we live. Only later would history reveal that fewer than 1 in 5 prisoner letters from Pacific camps ever reached Japan. Censors burned or stored them in warehouses, unread and unreturned. Entire voices erased before they ever crossed the ocean. The women never knew. They kept writing week after week, convinced their families might somehow sense them through the paper. A U.S. officer collecting the envelopes hesitated over Aiko's Bible. He flipped through its pages and found the letter hidden between psalms. Unauthorized, he muttered, pocketing it. She watched, expression blank, as the last piece of her identity disappeared into his file pouch. Still, the act of writing changed something. It reminded them they were more than bodies in borrowed clothes. It gave shape to the silence. One woman whispered, even if no one reads it, it's proof we were here. Her words faded into the sound of rain on the tin roof. Outside, engines rumbled, A Red Cross jeep approaching the gate, white emblem glinting through the mud. The guards straightened their helmets. The inspection was about to begin. The morning smelled of disinfectant and staged cleanliness. Everything that could be scrubbed had been scrubbed. The mud swept from pathways, uniforms brushed, guards freshly shaved. Word had spread fast. The International Red Cross was coming. For one day, the camp would pretend to be merciful. An American officer barked orders as prisoners were lined up. The Japanese women stood in uneven rows, their patched skirts pressed as best they could manage. An interpreter whispered, "Smile when they take pictures." Cameras clicked, shutters snapping like small explosions. The women obeyed, eyes hollow, lips trembling. Somewhere behind the lens, a Red Cross representative jotted notes, not realizing the garments beneath those smiles were made from men's torn underwear. One nurse held a blanket close around her waist, hiding the stitched seams. Another stood perfectly still, her hand brushing against the crude fabric that marked every humiliation. Reports later showed that out of 60, 2 Pacific inspections conducted by the Red Cross, fewer than a handful included Japanese female prisoners. Most records were reduced to vague summaries, adequate rations, fair conditions. The truth didn't fit tidy categories. A translator asked if they had any complaints. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then a young woman bowed slightly and said, "We have everything we need." The interpreter nodded, pleased. The cameras whirred again, a false piece captured on film. But in the corners of the camp, not everything was choreographed. A Red Cross nurse, an American, noticed the women's hands, raw from stitching, their clothing too thin for the weather. She whispered something to her colleague. They shouldn't be dressed like this. He nodded but said nothing. Later, she wrote quietly in her report, "Female prisoners lack proper clothing, morale visibly low." It would be filed away, unseen for months. When the convoy left, the guards relaxed, lighting cigarettes and laughing softly. The camp exhaled, the performance over. The women went back to their quarters, peeling off forced smiles like masks. That night, the same nurse who had written the report looked out her jeep window as the camp faded behind dust and barbed wire. "We showed them only when we needed proof," one Japanese prisoner would later say. By dawn, new orders arrived. Relocation deeper inland. Engines roared before sunrise. The women were ordered out of the barracks, carrying whatever they could, a tin cup, a Bible, a bundle of patched clothes. Rain had turned the dirt road into thick brown paste. American soldiers shouted for them to climb aboard the trucks, canvas flaps snapping in the wind. One by one, they climbed the wooden steps, boots slipping, hands trembling. The convoy rumbled out of the camp, a string of olive, green trucks snaking through broken villages and burned trees. The smell of diesel mixed with sweat and fear. Inside the trucks, the women huddled close for warmth, their thin garments no match for the wind that tore through the gaps in the canvas. Every bump on the road sent a ripple of pain through tired bodies. A young American soldier riding in the back tried to offer a canteen of water. He hesitated, unsure if kindness was allowed. The Japanese nurse beside him accepted it wordlessly, drank, and returned it with both hands, a small gesture of respect that stunned him. Later he would write in his journal, "She looked at me like a human, not an enemy." The convoy rolled on for hours, over 2,000 miles of rough supply routes, crisscrossing the Philippines, and Borneo. Most prisoners were transported without explanation, just numbers on a roster. The women had no idea where they were being taken, only that the jungle was thinning and the air was colder. At one checkpoint, a guard handed out stale biscuits. One woman broke hers in half and shared it with another, her fingers shaking from exhaustion. The act went unnoticed by the soldiers, but among the prisoners, it meant everything proof that compassion still existed, even at the edge of humiliation. When dusk fell, the trucks halted in a valley surrounded by mist. The engines died, leaving only the hiss of cooling metal. "End of the line," a sergeant called out. The women climbed down slowly, their feet sinking into wet earth. In the distance, rows of new barracks stood waiting, darker and quieter than the last camp. As they stepped toward the new fences, one woman whispered, "Maybe this place will forget us." But the next morning they would meet someone who refused to. The new camp was quieter, colder, and smaller. Rows of corrugated tin huts sat between muddy trenches, smoke rising weakly from a single kitchen fire. The Japanese women, exhausted from the long convoy, were herded inside and told to rest. They didn't speak. They just listened to boots outside, to wind through cracks, to the low hum of American voices. But this place was different. The guards seemed wary, almost restrained. Among them was a young medic from Ohio, name stitched in fading thread, Corporal Mason. He wasn't like the others. He didn't shout or stare. The first thing he did was place a tin basin of warm water near the door and say, "Wash up. Infection spreads fast." His Japanese was clumsy, but the tone was unmistakable, concern not command. For the women it was disorienting. The same uniform that had stripped them of dignity was now offering kindness. A few hesitated before dipping their hands into the water, the heat biting at cracked skin. Mason returned each day bringing soap, gauze, once even a piece of chocolate broken into 6 equal parts. He never stayed long, just nodded and left quietly. In his daily report he noted nutritional deficiency among female POW dropping steadily, cooperation improving. By later estimates, malnutrition rates among Japanese women prisoners in supervised camps fell nearly 30% within months. Facts, on paper, couldn't describe what really shifted. Trust, thin as thread but strong enough to hold. The women began to greet him with small bows. One offered to mend his torn sleeve. He let her. Another thanked him for bandages by folding a paper crane from ration paper. They could destroy us or heal us, she would later recall, and they chose the second. Even the guards noticed the change. Conversations grew less tense. The word enemy lost its edge, replaced by something almost human. But Mason wasn't finished. One night, under the weak bulb of the infirmary, he opened his notebook and wrote a simple line. Need proper clothing issue. Morale critical. He knew the request would likely be denied. Still, he signed it anyway, sealed it, and sent it up the chain. And somewhere above him, that message began its slow crawl through the bureaucracy of war. The memo left the camp folded inside a canvas dispatch bag, just one more piece of paper in a war run by paperwork. It moved from desk to desk, first to the regional supply officer, then to the quartermaster division. Somewhere in a humid tent near Manila, a lieutenant unfolded it, squinting under a dim lantern. The line was brief but heavy. Request for female prisoner clothing issue urgent. He sighed. Female issue. There was no such category. Every uniform, every ration, Every spare button in the system was catalogued for men. The United States Army in 1944 had millions of uniforms in circulation, yet not one designed for a captured woman. Regulations didn't even contain the word female under prisoner logistics. The lieutenant scribbled across the form, "Denied, no stock available." Then he tossed it into the pile. Meanwhile, in the camp, Corporal Mason waited for a reply that never came. He checked the supply truck each week, hoping for a miracle hidden between boxes of canned beans and medical gauze. Nothing. Still, he kept asking, maybe next shipment. He told the women, though his voice betrayed doubt. Official reports later showed that over 6 million uniforms were sitting unused in Pacific warehouses that year. A mountain of fabric for men, but none for dignity. Paper moves faster than mercy. One clerk muttered as he stamped the denial. Word spread among the ranks that Mason had pushed the request too far. Some mocked him for coddling the enemy. Others shrugged. Orders were orders. But one night, a sergeant in the supply depot overheard Mason talking about the women, how they were still wearing patched underwear meant for soldiers twice their size. The sergeant didn't say anything then, but something in his face changed. Back in the barracks, the women continued to mend, patch, and wash what little they had. The fabric had grown thin, nearly translucent. When they bent near the firelight, the seams shimmered like ghost threads. They were surviving, but barely. And somewhere between conscience and regulation, that sergeant made his choice. He waited until the next shipment came in bales of spare fatigues and burlap, and decided one crate would quietly go missing. That single act would rewrite their story. Night in the depot was thick with humidity and guilt. The sergeant moved quietly between stacked crates, flashlight beam trembling across stenciled letters. U.S. Army Supply, Property of War Department. He paused at one marked Textiles Non-Essential, a perfect cover. One look over his shoulder, and he began to pry the lid loose. Inside were rolls of burlap, torn fatigues, and discarded blankets. He exhaled. This would do. He loaded the bundle into the back of a jeep, covered it with scrap canvas, and drove without headlights. The camp was 20 minutes away, down a road littered with mud and memories. By the time he reached the gate, the guards on duty knew better than to ask questions. "Medical supplies," he said. They nodded him through. Inside the women's barracks, the sound of the jeep startled everyone awake. When the door creaked open, the sergeant dropped the bundle on the floor. "For repairs," he muttered, eyes averted. For a second, no one moved. Then one woman stepped forward, hands trembling, and touched the fabric like it was gold. The others followed, whispering disbelief. That single bale, enough to make clothing for 40 people, would later vanish from inventory without explanation. No investigation, no reprimand, just silence. Sometimes silence is mercy. For 3 nights the women worked by candlelight, cutting, knotting, and reshaping. They turned burlap sacks into skirts, fatigues into blouses, even scraps of gauze into belts. The air filled with the smell of sweat and thread wax, the rhythm of scissors snipping like metronomes of defiance. "He risked his rank for our dignity," one woman said quietly, but no one dared to thank him aloud. By dawn they stood in their new clothes, crude but clean, rough but theirs. When sunlight streamed through the slats, it glinted on the seams like armor. They looked at each other and smiled for the first time in months. Then, as if summoned by fate, the click of a camera echoed from outside. A military photographer passing through stopped, astonished by the sight. Japanese women prisoners, proud and composed, in garments of their own making. He raised the lens. The shutter snapped once, and that single photograph would outlive them all. When the war finally collapsed in 1945, the camps emptied in silence. The Japanese women were thin but standing, each one carrying the weight of memories stitched from humiliation and survival. Among the debris left behind, a photograph lay tucked inside a supply ledger, its edges curled from the heat. Black and white, grainy, almost accidental, yet it captured something history had nearly erased. In the image, the women stand side by side in their handmade garments, sunlight slicing across their faces. No chains, no weapons, just quiet defiance. One smiles faintly, the kind of smile that says, "We lived." Behind them, a jeep half in shadow, the sergeant's outline barely visible. The camera had caught what official reports ignored, the dignity they rebuilt with their own hands. For decades, no one knew who took that photo. It sat mislabeled in an archive as Civilian Women Pacific Theater. Only later did historians realize these weren't civilians at all, but Japanese female prisoners of war, a rarity so extreme that only one verified photograph is known to exist. That single frame became testimony for hundreds who never spoke again. When it resurfaced in a National Archives scan, researchers noticed the details, the uneven stitches, the fabric creases, the faint fatigue logos still visible on the cloth. Those imperfections told a story words couldn't. They weren't wearing uniforms, they were wearing survival. One historian wrote, "Their shame became their armor." Another simply noted, "This is the only proof they existed." It was enough. Through that frozen second of film, their silence roared across 70 years. In interviews decades later, descendants of one captured nurse recalled how she never spoke about the camp. But every year, she mended her clothes by hand, even when she could afford new ones, needle by needle. Her granddaughter said she was remembering. The photograph now rests in a climate, controlled vault, scanned in high resolution, circulated online with the wrong caption corrected at last. The women stare out from that black and white eternity, no longer invisible, no longer unnamed. They wore men's torn underwear once, turned it into something human, something unbreakable. Survival, they proved, isn't about victory. It's about refusing to vanish.